My name is Carolyn Reeves, and I'm 31 years old. 2 months ago, I discovered that my parents had rewritten their will and given my entire inheritance to my sister. Not a portion, not a larger share, everything. I found out when a probate lawyer played me an audio recording of my mother's voice, and what I heard in that recording shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. The way that lawyer presented the evidence, the shock on his face, the way he looked at me with something between pity and professional concern, that moment changed everything. But before I tell you what that lawyer revealed and how he helped me understand the truth about my family, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel. I know that sounds like a generic ask, but I genuinely mean it. I share stories about family betrayal, about people who discover that the people closest to them were capable of unimaginable cruelty, about people who gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left of themselves. So if you're someone who's ever felt taken advantage of by family, if you've ever sacrificed your own needs for people who didn't appreciate it, this channel might speak to you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I love connecting with all of you. I want to know your stories too. Now, let me take you back to where this all started. Back to my childhood, back to the very beginning of this pattern that I didn't even realize was forming. Growing up in the Reeves household was like living under a carefully constructed illusion. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. 2 parents who stayed married, 3 daughters who got along well enough, a nice house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and a manicured lawn. We took family vacations every summer to places like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. My father, Richard, was a successful accountant with a corner office at a prestigious firm downtown. My mother, Susan, was a retired teacher who had left her job when Emma was born. They seemed like reasonable people, fair people, people who understood the importance of treating their children equally. But the reality behind closed doors was much more complicated than what the neighbors saw. I was the middle daughter, born between 2 other girls who seemed to fit into our family's narrative in ways that I never quite did. There was Claire, 3 years older, who was the golden child from day one. Smart, beautiful, effortlessly popular, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became the center of attention without even trying. Teachers loved her. Peers wanted to be her friend. My parents lit up when she entered a room. And then there was my younger sister, Emma, who was 7 years younger than me. From the moment she was born, I remember my parents treating her differently, special, delicate, fragile, like she was made of something more precious than the rest of us, something that required extra care and attention and protection. I didn't resent this at first. That's it. She was the baby. Of course, my parents wanted to take care of her. But something shifted as we all grew older. The special treatment didn't fade the way you'd expect. If anything, it intensified. Emma got her own car at 16. Claire got one too because it seemed unfair not to. I got nothing, but I was told I could use the family car whenever I needed it. Emma got a generous allowance. Claire had a trust fund set up. I was encouraged to get a job. When Emma wanted to take dance lessons, our mother drove her to practice 3 times a week. When I asked about piano lessons, I was told they couldn't afford it right now, maybe next year. But next year never came. I don't remember exactly when I realized I didn't fit into their narrative. Maybe it was my 13th birthday when my parents forgot to buy a cake because they were occupied with Emma's school play that evening. Maybe it was when I got straight A's in high school and my father's response was a distracted, "That's good, Caroline, keep it up," while he spent the entire evening helping Claire practice for her college entrance interviews, drilling her on essay prompts. Maybe it was the constant comparison, the subtle suggestions that I needed to be more like my sisters, more outgoing like Claire, more delicate like Emma, less like myself. My parents didn't overtly favor Claire and Emma, at least not in ways they acknowledged. But their actions spoke louder than words ever could. I learned to make myself smaller, to ask for less, to celebrate their achievements without expecting the same celebration in return, to take up less space, less time, less of their emotional energy. By the time I was 15, I'd internalized a fundamental belief about my place in the world. My worth in this family was dependent on how much I could give without asking for anything back. My value was tied directly to my usefulness. I became the helpful daughter, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much, the independent one. I got a job at 16 at a local grocery store, worked nights and weekends, and paid for my own school supplies, my own clothes, my own college fund. I didn't ask my parents for spending money like Claire constantly did. I didn't demand their attention and emotional support like Emma constantly did, always needing them to fix something or console her about something. I just quietly existed in the space between them, making myself useful, making myself necessary, but never quite making myself truly seen or valued for who I was. This pattern continued seamlessly into adulthood. I was the first one to call and check on them when I went to college. I visited more frequently than my sisters, driving 4 hours every other weekend. When my father had health issues in his 50s, I was the one researching treatments online and coordinating appointments with his doctors. I drove him to see specialists. When my mother needed emotional support about her aging parents or her marriage struggles, I was the one she'd call at midnight, the one who'd listen for hours without complaint. I'd give her advice, sometimes ignoring my own problems to focus on hers. I told myself this was just who I was, the kind of person I'd always been, the dutiful daughter, the caring one, the responsible one. But somewhere deep inside, there was a part of me that was keeping score. Not consciously, not in a way I acknowledged or admitted to myself, but it was there nonetheless. The knowledge that I was giving so much more than I was receiving, that I was investing in relationships that seemed fundamentally unequal, that I was sacrificing my own needs and desires for people who had never asked me to do so, but who had certainly accepted everything I offered. And then my father got sick in a way that couldn't be ignored or managed from a distance. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer when I was 28 years old. It was unexpected and absolutely devastating. I remember the day my mother called me with the news. I was at work, in a marketing meeting, when my phone buzzed with her name. I stepped out into the hallway. Her voice was shaking. "Caroline, it's your father. The doctor called. It's cancer. Stage 4. He needs surgery immediately, and then chemotherapy. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle this." I felt everything shift in that moment. Without thinking, without calculating the cost to my own life and career, I said, "I'll be there tonight." That night, I started making arrangements. I called my boss and asked for a leave of absence. I called my landlord and explained the situation. I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house and never really left. I moved back into my childhood bedroom. I became his primary caregiver. Every morning, I helped him with his medications and his physical therapy, these strange exercises designed to maintain his strength. Every afternoon, I sat with him in uncomfortable hospital chairs while he endured chemotherapy or radiation, watching the poison that was supposed to save him make him sicker and sicker. Every evening, I prepared his meals from recipes designed for cancer patients, soft foods that wouldn't hurt his throat or upset his stomach. I helped him with basic tasks that had become impossible for him. I drove him to appointments. I cleaned up after him when he couldn't make it to the bathroom. I sat by his bed at 3 a.m. when the pain was bad and the medication wasn't working. Emma occasionally visited, usually with excuses about her busy schedule, about how she needed to maintain her job and her relationship, about how she just couldn't handle seeing Dad like this. She'd stay for an hour and then leave. Claire sent flowers and called once a week with sympathy in her voice, but no real offers to help. But I was there, every single day, every single hour, for 18 months. I didn't resent it at the time, not really. He was my father. Of course I'd do this. This was what love meant. This was what family was supposed to do. But I also thought it meant something. I thought it proved something about me and my family, about the bonds between us. I thought my parents understood that I was the one who truly cared, the one who was willing to sacrifice everything. I thought that when this was over, when he died, things would be different. Things would change. My father died after 18 months of illness. The last year was mostly just pain management and waiting for the end. His funeral was sad but peaceful. He was no longer suffering. My mother delivered a eulogy that emphasized how much my parents had taught us about loyalty and family, about showing up for people you love even when it's hard. I remember thinking those words applied most directly to me, to my loyalty to them, to my willingness to sacrifice myself. She talked about sacrifice and love and family bonds. I sat there thinking about all the nights I'd sat by his bedside, all the days I'd put my life on hold. After his death, I expected things to change slightly. I thought maybe my mother would acknowledge the sacrifice I'd made during those 18 months. I thought maybe the dynamics of our family might shift. I thought maybe she would see me differently now, see how much I loved her, how much I was willing to do for her. Instead, everything seemed to normalize far more quickly than I expected. My mother grieved, yes, but she also seemed to become closer to Claire and Emma in ways she'd never been with me. They invited her to brunches at fancy restaurants. They took her on shopping trips to the mall and to boutiques downtown. They threw her birthday parties. I was invited to these events, yes, but I was always on the periphery, not quite central to these new, bonding rituals they were creating. I was included, but not essential, not chosen. About 6 months after my father's death, when my mother seemed to be settling into her new life as a widow, she mentioned casually at dinner one evening that she was updating her will with the family lawyer. I didn't think much of it at the time. Of course she was. My father had just died, and a lot of his assets had passed to her. She needed to make sure her affairs were in order, to create a clear plan for what would happen to everything after she was gone. It was responsible and smart. I thought she'd distribute her estate fairly among the three of us. Maybe not equally, because I knew my parents had never really believed in equal treatment, but reasonably. There was a house worth about $700,000. There were some investments my father had made over the years. There were retirement accounts and life insurance money. Not an enormous fortune, but a comfortable sum. Enough that it would have made a real difference in each of our lives if divided equally. Enough that when I was older and perhaps wanted to change careers or take time off to start a family, I would have had that financial cushion. Security, peace of mind, the kind of thing a parent is supposed to provide to their children. I didn't ask her about the specific details. I didn't think I needed to. I assumed that after everything, after 18 months of me being there and my sister's not, after 18 months of me sacrificing everything, that my mother would understand what fairness meant. I assumed I would be treated fairly by my own mother. That assumption was my biggest mistake. I found out about the will in the most painful possible way, and not from my mother. I was at my mother's house one afternoon, helping her organize some papers and old photographs, when her lawyer called about finalizing some documents. She mentioned that the will was complete and ready for her signature. I didn't think anything of it. Just a routine legal matter. She went to take the call in the other room. I could hear her voice, but not her words. When she came back, she seemed distracted. She didn't mention the call or what it was about. I didn't press her. A few days later, I was at her house again, doing yard work, when I overheard her on the phone with Emma. She was talking about money. She said, "You'll be very comfortable, Emma. Very comfortable indeed." I felt something strange when I heard that. A sense of unease that I couldn't quite name, but I pushed it aside. 3 weeks after I overheard that phone call, my mother had a minor fall at home. Nothing serious, but she was shaken by it. She called me over and asked if I could help her contact the lawyer about something. She wanted to add some details to her will, some final revisions. I made the call. Mr. Roberts, the lawyer, said he'd be happy to discuss it, but he suggested that my mother come to his office in person for these final revisions, or if that wasn't possible, he could send over some documents for her to review and sign. My mother was tired that day and seemed anxious about the fall, so I offered to go with her to the office. She hesitated, then agreed. We made an appointment for 3 days later. The lawyer's office was in a professional building downtown, quiet and wood-paneled, the kind of place that smells like money and permanence and the weight of important decisions. Mr. Roberts was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses that hung around his neck on a chain. He greeted us warmly in the lobby and ushered us into his office. It was decorated with law degrees and pictures of what I assumed were satisfied clients. My mother sat across from his desk in a leather chair. I sat slightly behind her, thinking I'd be an observer, just here to help her with anything she needed. But Mr. Roberts looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "I assume you're here because you want to hear what's in the will?" I felt my mother immediately stiffen beside me. She turned to me and said sharply, "Caroline, maybe you should wait in the lobby." Her tone made my stomach drop. Something about the way she said it, the urgency, the fear almost. But I had a strange feeling about this whole situation. I told her I'd be happy to wait elsewhere if she preferred, but something in that moment made me want to stay. Something was wrong, and I needed to know what it was. "Actually," Mr. Roberts said carefully, adjusting his glasses, "I think it might be better if Carolyn hears this from me rather than from you later. When she reads the will after you've passed away, there are going to be questions, and you might not be able to answer them fairly." My mother's face went pale, genuinely pale, like all the blood had drained from her cheeks. I sat back down slowly. Mr. Roberts adjusted his glasses again and looked directly at my mother. His tone was professional, but also deeply concerned. "Susan, I want to be very clear about something. You know, this isn't legally questionable. You have the absolute right to distribute your assets however you see fit. This is your property, your money, your estate. The law says you can do exactly what you're doing. But I want to make sure you understand the implications of what you've done. The message you're sending. You've left everything to Emma, your entire estate, the house, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, all the life insurance proceeds, everything. You've left Claire a sum of $50,000 as a sort of acknowledgement, I suppose. And Caroline, you've left nothing, nothing at all." The room went absolutely silent. I couldn't feel my hands. I don't think I breathed. I don't think my heart beat. I was aware of every single second of silence that followed that statement. Every second of my mother not denying it. "There must be a mistake," I heard myself say. My voice sounded very far away, like it was coming from someone else. "There's no mistake, Mr. Roberts said gently but firmly. "I've reviewed the documents multiple times. I've reviewed them with your mother. Multiple times. This is what Susan decided." I looked at my mother. Her face was carefully composed, like she was trying to control every muscle in it, but her hands were trembling in her lap. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was looking at the desk, at her hands, at anything but me. "Susan," Mr. Roberts continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "Caroline has every right to ask why. And I'm concerned enough about this decision that I'm wondering if perhaps we should discuss it further before you sign the amended will. Take some time. Talk to someone. Understand what you're doing." My mother finally looked at me, but her expression was closed off, defensive, like she'd built a wall between us in that instant. "It's my money, Caroline. I'm allowed to make my own decisions about what to do with it." Her voice was cold. Not angry, not emotional, but cold. Like I was a stranger asking her to explain herself. "Of course you are," I said quietly, feeling tears start to form that I refused to let fall. "But I'd like to know why. I need to understand why. Why would you leave me nothing? I was here for Dad. I was here for you. I gave up 18 months of my life to care for him. I'm here now. Whenever you need me, I'm always here. And you're leaving me nothing while Emma, who barely visits, gets everything? How is that fair? How is that right?" My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping backward. "I don't want to discuss this." She turned to Mr. Roberts. "I'd like to sign the will as it is. I've made my decision." I felt something crack inside my chest, something essential breaking apart. Mr. Roberts looked genuinely uncomfortable now, like he was watching something painful unfold in his office. "Susan, I really do think you should reconsider. I'm going to suggest that you take some time with this decision. Perhaps talk to a family therapist. Perhaps talk to someone who can help you understand what you're communicating to your daughter by making this choice, what message this sends. I've thought about it plenty, my mother said coldly. She sat back down and looked directly at me for the first time since this conversation started. And then she said something that would echo in my mind for months to come. Something that would replay in my head at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. Emma deserves it more. She's always needed more from me. She's had a harder life. You've always been fine, Caroline. You've always been independent. You don't need my money the way Emma does. You never have needed me the way they do. There it was. The truth that had always been lurking beneath the surface of my entire childhood and adulthood. The explanation for everything. I had been too independent, too capable, too willing to help without asking for anything back. I had made myself into someone who didn't need anything, and my mother had internalized that so completely that she actually believed I deserved nothing. I walked out of that office in a daze. I don't remember the elevator ride down. I don't remember walking to my car. But I was sitting in the driver's seat with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't turn the key. This wasn't real. My mother couldn't have done this. She couldn't have told me that my independence was a liability, that my willingness to sacrifice meant I didn't deserve to be provided for. Mr. Roberts had seemed shocked. He tried to intervene, suggested therapy, suggested reconsideration, but my mother refused to budge. That night, I sat in my apartment and made a list. Everything I'd given up, every sacrifice I'd made. Not to be bitter, but to understand. 18 months with my father, watching him die. My career progression, sacrificed during those 18 months. My relationships, because I couldn't focus on dating or friendships when I was caring for him. My independence wasn't a strength to my mother. It was an excuse. It was the reason she could tell herself I didn't need her, didn't deserve her, was unworthy of her support. By being strong for my father, by being strong for her, I'd made myself ineligible for her love in her mind. The love had to be earned through need. The more you needed, the more you deserved. The less you needed, the less you merited. It was a backwards equation, and I'd been failing it my entire life without even knowing the rules of the game. 3 days after that meeting in Mr. Roberts' office, I received a call from him. I was surprised to hear from him directly. He said he wanted to discuss something with me, something he felt I needed to know. He asked if I could come back to his office. I was nervous, but I agreed. When I arrived, he seemed more formal than before, more professional. He closed his door and asked me to sit. He told me something that would change everything. He said, "Caroline, I wanted to speak with you privately about something. In all my years of practice, I've seen many difficult family situations, but what I witnessed in my office with your mother was deeply troubling. I want you to understand that legally she can do this. But I have documentation. I have an audio recording of your mother from before you arrived that day. She called me to discuss the will. She left a voicemail message. I think you should hear it." He played the recording, and my mother's voice came through the speaker, unguarded, unaware she was being recorded. She talked about me. She talked about how I'd always been too independent, how I'd never needed her, how she felt guilty about not helping me more, but knowing I could handle things on my own. She talked about how Emma had always been sensitive, had always needed her more, had struggled more in life. And then she said something that made me understand how deep this went. She said, "If I leave Caroline anything, it will just make her think I see her as weak. She's proud of being able to do things on her own. I'd be insulting her by providing for her the way I'm providing for Emma." She said, "If I leave Caroline anything, it will just make her think I see her as weak. She's proud of being able to do things on her own. I'd be insulting her by providing for her the way I'm providing for Emma." I sat there listening to the recording play out. My mother's voice explaining away my worth, rationalizing why I deserved nothing. Mr. Roberts watched my face carefully, watching to see if I understood the implication of what I was hearing. When the recording ended, there was only silence. The weight of her words hung between us like something physical and suffocating. I felt something inside me die in that moment. Not my love for my mother, but the hope that she'd ever actually seen me, that she'd ever truly understood what my independence cost me, that she'd ever recognized what I'd sacrificed. She'd taken my greatest strength, the thing I'd spent 18 months proving with my father's care, and she'd used it as a weapon against me, used it to justify giving me nothing. Mr. Roberts removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked exhausted, like he'd witnessed this kind of family cruelty too many times before. He said, "Caroline, I'm going to be honest with you about what we're dealing with here. Your mother has made a legal decision. She has every right to make it. But I think what she's done here reveals something important, something that maybe your family needs to confront." He sat back and explained something to me that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. He told me about his practice, about how he'd handled hundreds of probate cases over 30 years. He said the ones that haunted him most weren't the ones where there was fraud or clear undue influence. They were the ones where parents made decisions based on faulty reasoning, decisions they later regretted with every fiber of their being. He said he'd been in rooms with dying mothers who finally understood what they'd done, who finally recognized the harm, but it was always too late. "Caroline," he said, leaning forward, "I want to do something I haven't done in years. I want to investigate this more thoroughly, not to find legal grounds to contest it, though we can explore that, but to understand it, to document the truth of what happened during your father's illness. And then, I want to present that truth to your family. Sometimes when people see facts instead of rationalizations, they change. Not always, but sometimes." After hearing that recording, Mr. Roberts asked me if I wanted to pursue legal action. I didn't even know that was possible. He explained that what my mother was doing was legal, yes, but that there were other angles to explore. He told me about something called undue influence. He said it refers to situations where a person's judgment has been compromised by external pressure or manipulation. He said my mother's reasoning, the fact that she'd rationalized my independence as disqualifying me from inheritance, was potentially problematic. But here was the thing. Proving undue influence would be nearly impossible. There was no evidence that anyone had pressured her. She'd simply convinced herself that I didn't deserve anything. That was her decision, made freely, based on her own twisted log. "Ici, the law is on her side here," Mr. Roberts said plainly. "She can distribute her estate however she wants. That's not what concerns me. What concerns me is that she's made this decision based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who you are and what you deserve. She's told herself a story about your strength being a liability, and she's building her entire decision on that story without ever confronting its falsity." He stood and walked to his window, looking out over the downtown area. The city spread out below, thousands of lives unfolding, thousands of families navigating their own complicated dynamics. He said, "I had a client once, a father who'd spent his entire career focused on his successful son. The daughter worked as a nurse, never made much money, very quiet, very independent. The father decided she didn't need his help, so he left everything to his son. The daughter contested it after his death, and I helped her through the legal process. But you know what? It was messy. It was years of litigation. The family basically imploded. The son became resentful because he felt she was being ungrateful. The daughter was bitter because her father's rejection had been made official in the legal document. Everyone lost." He turned back to face me. "That's not what I want to happen to your family. Not if I can help it." What he proposed was something different than litigation. He asked me to document everything. He gave me a list of things to gather: medical records showing my involvement in my father's care, doctor's notes that mentioned my presence and participation in decisions, receipts and bank statements showing every penny I'd spent on his treatment, calendar entries and emails that documented my presence at every appointment. He asked me to create a timeline of those 18 months, detailed and thorough, showing exactly how I'd spent my time and energy. He asked me to document my employment status during that period, showing that I'd left my job. He asked for anything that would paint a picture of the enormous sacrifice I'd made. "I'm not gathering this for litigation," he told me. "Not yet, anyway. I'm gathering this because facts have power. Your mother has told herself a story based on feeling and guilt and her own issues. But when confronted with facts, sometimes that story crumbles. Sometimes people are forced to actually see what happened instead of the version they've created in their mind." He asked me to gather documentation about my father's illness and my role in his care. Medical records that showed my involvement. Bank records that showed I'd paid for treatments. Calendar entries showing my presence at every appointment. Emails, text messages, anything that would create a factual record of those 18 months. He wanted to build a timeline, not for legal purposes necessarily, but for the record. He wanted to have facts organized that could be presented to my family. He wanted the truth documented before it got lost in the aftermath of grief and regret and the hardening of positions. Over the next month, I collected everything. It was painful, honestly. Going back through those documents meant reliving those 18 months. I went through my bank statements and pulled out every transfer to medical providers, every payment for prescriptions, every purchase of specialized equipment, every copay and deductible. I made copies of doctor's notes that mentioned my presence and participation in care decisions. I printed out emails from my boss about my leave of absence. I pulled emails from my father's oncology team that talked about who they should contact for medical decisions, and it was always me. I created a detailed spreadsheet showing the 18 months of caregiving, hour by hour almost, the time I'd spent, the sacrifices I'd made. I created a narrative timeline showing exactly what happened from diagnosis to death to the aftermath. When I brought it all to Mr. Roberts' office, I had 3 large folders full of documentation. He spent hours reviewing it, making notes, reading through the medical records carefully. I watched his face as he read through the specifics. The radiation treatments I'd attended, the chemotherapy sessions I'd sat through, the emergency room visits in the middle of the night, the funeral arrangements I'd made. He read through my bank records and calculated the total I'd spent out of pocket. Over $40,000. He looked up at me after reading that number and didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me with something like sadness and anger combined. "Your mother told you that she couldn't afford to pay for your piano lessons," he said quietly. "But she had money. She always had money. What she didn't have was the desire to prioritize you. What she didn't have was the willingness to sacrifice for you the way you sacrificed for your father." He said, "Caroline, your mother made a choice, and that choice is going to stand legally. You can't contest it without evidence of undue influence, and we don't have that clear-cut evidence. But I think your family needs to see this. I think they need to understand what they're looking at. And I'm going to request a meeting. Your mother, your sisters, you. I'm going to present this evidence, and I'm going to ask your mother if she still stands by this decision after seeing the documented reality of what you sacrificed. I've done this before. Sometimes, when people see facts instead of rationalizations, they change their minds. Sometimes they don't, but they deserve the chance to know what they're actually choosing." My mother initially refused the meeting. She didn't want to face what Mr. Roberts was suggesting. She said over the phone that she knew what I'd done, that she didn't need documentation to explain her own decisions. She sounded defensive, almost angry. But Emma called me directly and asked what was going on. She said she wanted to know more about what Mr. Roberts wanted to discuss. And Claire reached out to me and asked if everything was okay. Mr. Roberts was persistent but professional with my mother. He told her this was important, that the family needed to have this conversation, that avoiding it was only going to create more damage in the long run. He didn't pressure her, but he made it clear that he thought this mattered. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of going back and forth, my mother agreed. The meeting took place on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November. Mr. Roberts had arranged his conference room carefully. We sat around his long wooden table. My mother at one end, me at the other, Claire and Emma on opposite sides. The lawyer had asked them to come without preconceived notions about what this would be. He told them it was important for the family's future that they be present for this conversation. Mr. Roberts opened by explaining that the purpose of this meeting wasn't to challenge his mother's legal right to do what she was doing. It was to present facts that he thought the family should have before any final decisions were made. He said, "Susan, you have every right to distribute your estate however you see fit. That's not what we're here to discuss. What we're here to discuss is whether you understand the full context of the decision you're making, whether you have all the facts." He pulled out my documentation. He had organized it beautifully, almost like a presentation. A thick folder with tabs and sections and everything clearly labeled. He walked through the 18 months of my father's illness, month by month. He showed the calendar entries he'd asked me for, showing every single medical appointment, the radiation sessions, the chemotherapy treatments, the emergency room visits. He showed the dates and times. He read from the doctor's notes that mentioned my involvement, my decision-making, my presence through every crisis. He read the names of the specialists I'd coordinated with, the treatment plans I'd helped devise, the conversations I'd had with medical teams about my father's care. He pulled out my bank records and read through them carefully, showing the room each transfer to medical providers, each prescription copay, each purchase of medical equipment. He calculated it out loud, showing my mother the spreadsheet I'd created. The total, $43,000 out of my own pocket. He then looked at my mother and asked, "Do you remember when Caroline asked for piano lessons as a teenager? When she asked if she could take classes?" My mother didn't respond. "Your daughter asked for something that would have cost maybe $2,000 over a few years, and you told her you couldn't afford it. But you could afford to give Emma music lessons, and Claire's car, and all of the other things you provided to them, and yet you couldn't afford music lessons for the daughter who is now sitting in front of you having spent over $40,000 on her father's medical care." Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He turned to me and said, "Caroline, would you be willing to describe what those 18 months were actually like? Not the facts on paper, but the reality of it?" I didn't want to. I didn't want to sit there and convince my mother that my suffering mattered. I didn't want to reduce those 18 months to a narrative that might move her heart. But Mr. Roberts looked at me with something like encouragement, and I realized that this might be the only chance I ever got to make her understand. So I talked. I talked about the nights I sat by my father's bed at 3 a.m. when the pain medication wasn't working and he was crying, actually crying, something I'd never heard my father do before his illness. I talked about learning how to manage his medications, understanding which ones to give at which times, understanding the side effects and how to manage them. I talked about the day I had to help him with basic bodily functions and realized that this was my life now, that this was who I'd become. I talked about the friends I stopped calling because I couldn't explain why I was never available, the job opportunities I turned down, the dating life I sacrificed. I talked about sitting in the chemotherapy waiting room for hours, watching my father become weaker and weaker, knowing that I was the person he reached for, that I was essential in those last months of his life. I talked about my father's last day, about holding his hand while he died, about being the one person he wanted with him at the end. My mother didn't look at me. She looked at the table throughout my entire story. She looked at her hands. She looked at the folder full of evidence of my sacrifice. She looked anywhere but at me. Emma started crying. She said, "I didn't know. I didn't know it was like that. Mom, I didn't know. I thought Caroline was just home. I thought she was just there with him. I didn't understand what she was actually doing." Emma looked at me with something like shock in her eyes. "You gave up everything." Claire looked at me and something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Understanding of the gap between what I'd done and what she'd done. She said quietly, "I left. I just didn't deal with it. I couldn't handle seeing him like that, and I just left. And you were here the whole time. You stayed." Mr. Roberts then leaned forward and said something that changed everything. He said, "Susan, I want you to look at your daughter. I want you to really look at her and tell me why she deserves nothing. Why the person who sacrificed everything, who spent $40,000, who sat by her father's bed while he died. Why does she deserve nothing? My mother finally met my eyes. When she did, I saw that hers were filled with tears. She sat there for a long moment, and I could see her struggling, actually struggling with something deep inside. Then she said, "Because I can't face it. I can't face what she gave up. It hurts too much to acknowledge what you sacrificed, because then I have to acknowledge that I wasn't there. I wasn't strong enough. And if I give you the money, it feels like I'm admitting that I failed you, that I wasn't enough. It's easier if you're fine, if you're independent, if you don't need me. Because then I'm not a failure." There it was. The real reason? Not that I was too independent, but that my mother couldn't bear her own guilt. She'd convinced herself that punishing me was easier than confronting her own inadequacy, that my not receiving an inheritance was somehow less damaging to her than acknowledging that she'd abandoned me during the most difficult period of my life. The will wasn't changed that day, but something else changed. My mother admitted, in front of everyone, that she had made a mistake. Not a legal mistake, but a mistake in her reasoning. A mistake in how she'd hurt me. She didn't immediately say she'd rewrite the will, but she said she wanted to talk to someone about it. She said she wanted time to think about what this decision really meant. She asked for time and space to process what she'd just heard. After that meeting, I didn't hear from my mother for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of silence that I wasn't sure would end with reconciliation or with her doubling down on her original decision. But then one evening, she called me. She asked if I would come to see her. Not at Mr. Roberts' office, at home, at the house where I'd grown up. I drove there on a gray afternoon, not knowing what to expect. We sat in her living room, the house that I'd spent my childhood in, surrounded by family photos and memories. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile. She told me that she had been seeing a therapist. She said that after the meeting, she couldn't not see a therapist. She said that hearing me talk about those 18 months, hearing me say the things I'd kept inside for so long, had broken something open in her that needed professional help to address. She'd been working with the therapist on understanding why she'd made the decision she'd made, on understanding how her own guilt and shame had translated into punishment of me. She told me that she was changing her will. She said she couldn't live with what she'd done. She said it was eating her alive. She said that every time she looked at me, she saw the sacrifice I'd made, and it made her feel sick that she'd responded to that sacrifice with rejection. She said she was going to split her estate equally between the 3 of us. Claire and Emma both got a portion, and I got my portion. The same portion as my sisters. Not as charity, not as guilt money, but as what I had always deserved. She also said something that I needed to hear. She looked me directly in the eye and said, "I'm sorry. I am so deeply sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for making you small. I'm sorry for teaching you that love had to be earned through suffering. I'm sorry for making you feel like your independence was a weakness when it was the most courageous thing you've ever done. I'm sorry for not seeing you, for making you invisible, for punishing you for being strong when I was too weak to be what you needed." She reached out and took my hand. She said, "I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the years of making you feel less valued than your sisters. I can't take back the way I excluded you during the hardest time of your life. But I can change what happens from here. I can change how I treat you going forward. And I'm asking you to give me the chance to do that." We didn't magically repair our relationship. The damage that had been done was real and it lingered. But we began to rebuild something from the ruins. Something that wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was real. My mother sought therapy to understand why she'd made that decision, why she'd rationalized such cruelty. She got help for her own issues around guilt and inadequacy and shame. Claire reached out to me afterwards and apologized for not being there, not just during my father's illness, but for years before that. We started having actual conversations, real ones, not just the surface-level ones we'd had our whole lives. Emma, my younger sister, called me and said, "Thank you for doing what you did for Dad. I know I wasn't brave enough to be there like you were. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. With the inheritance settled, I found myself with choices I'd never had before. Financial stability, security, the ability to think about my future without constant anxiety about money. I took time off work. I saw a therapist to process the trauma of what I'd experienced. I started dating someone genuinely, without the guilt of not being available to my family. I began to understand that my independence wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that I'd been conditioned to feel guilty about, that I'd been taught to apologize for, that I'd been punished for by the people who were supposed to support me. 5 years later, my life looks completely different. I'm in a relationship with someone who values me. I got a promotion at work. I moved into a beautiful apartment. I'm considering going back to graduate school, something I'd always dreamed about but felt I couldn't afford in time or money. But more importantly, I've learned something crucial about myself. My worth isn't determined by how much I can sacrifice. It's not measured by how little I ask for. It's not proven through suffering or selflessness or the ability to handle everything on my own. My mother called me on my birthday last month. She said, "I was thinking about that day in the lawyer's office, how angry and defensive I was, how I couldn't even look at you. And I just want you to know that I see you now. I actually see you, not as the strong one who doesn't need me, not as the backup plan. I see you as my daughter, a person with value, with needs, with dreams, with the right to be supported and loved without having to earn it." If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel like your independence is a liability, like your strength is a disqualification for love, like you have to earn basic human care and support, I want you to know something. That's not how families are supposed to work. Love shouldn't be a transaction. Inheritance shouldn't be punishment for being capable. You don't have to be broken to deserve to be cared for. You don't have to be struggling to merit support. Sometimes being the strong one just means you're exhausted, and you deserve to be held up too. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire story. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. I know some of you are dealing with similar situations right now, and I want you to know that there are people who can help. Lawyers, therapists, people who care. You don't have to carry this alone. And if you want to share your story in the comments, I'm listening. Until next time, remember your worth isn't something you earn. It's something you deserve from the moment you exist. Take care of yourself.